You know, one of the things I always tell you about is that we have always led in New Hampshire. We always have. But you don't know that too often, because one of the other characteristics of New Hampshireites, other than our great common sense, is that we tend to be very humble people. It always sounds silly when I come up here and say we're humble people, but we are humble people. And throughout our history, we have continuously led. When General Stark, at the end of the Revolutionary War, got off his horse and hung his sword up and said, "Now it's time to go back to my family," that's the kind of people New Hampshireites are. Humble. Tell us what you need us to do. We will do it. And when we're done, we go back to what we need to do. And that's how we do it. This next gentleman I'm going to introduce you to is one of my favorite New Hampshireites, without a doubt. If not my favorite New Hampshirite, pretty close to it. And I was convinced a long time ago, the first time I met him, that had we lived in 1776, and had we been back in that time, and this next gentleman was there, he would be one of our founding fathers. Without a doubt, his name would be everywhere. And once he did what he had to do, as humble New Hampshirites always do, he would go back and take care of his family and take care of his friends. But every once in a while, this next gentleman comes out and re-energizes us, reminds us of what the foundation is in New Hampshire. He is our spokesperson. He is one of the great New Hampshirites, and someday he'll admit it, because every time I say it, he blushes and he gets humble. But I'm never going to let him forget how much he means to New Hampshire. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Representative DanItse.
He always embarrasses me like that. I want you to consider why you're here today. I know why you're here today. You're here because you are Americans, but more importantly, you are New Hampshire Americans. And I want you to think about what it means. We had the first ride of Paul Revere and the first skirmish between colonists and the Redcoats at Fort William and Mary in December of 1774, and yes, that is before the 18th of April of 75. We had the first free government, independent of Great Britain, on January 5th in 1776. We had the first constitutional convention in the world in which the people began to form their own government. The New Hampshire House of Representatives was the first to pass no real ID. I want you to think about this, because we were doing that before we even really remembered, I use the word remembered, what nullification is. Would it surprise you to realize that the whole idea of nullification is wrapped up in the preamble of our first Constitution? I'm going to read you that preamble, and I'm going to explain it to you. And this isn't something I've been thinking about for a long time. This really came to me yesterday as I was riding up to Concord. Now, I realize that the departure of our late governor was because the people had rolled a cannon up to his front door requesting that he turn over a functionary. And he then went to Fort William and Mary and then on to become the governor of Nova Scotia. The sudden and abrupt departure of His Excellency John Wentworth, Esquire, our late governor, and several of the council, leaving us destitute of legislation and no executive courts being open to punish criminal offenders, whereby the lives and properties of the honest people of this colony are liable to the machinations and evil designs of wicked men. Therefore, to preserve the peace and good order, and for the security of the lives and properties of the inhabitants of this colony, we conceive ourselves reduced to establishing a form of government, to continue during the present unhappy and unnatural contest with Great Britain, protesting and declaring that we never sought to throw off our dependence upon Great Britain, but felt ourselves happy under her protection, while we could enjoy our constitutional rights and privileges, and that we shall rejoice if such a reconciliation between us and our parent state can be effected, as shall be approved by the Continental Congress, in whose prudence and wisdom we confide. The whole architecture of American government is wrapped up in that. New Hampshire was formed to protect the honest people from the wicked. It was all internal. Having formed that government, they saw themselves in a position of interposition between the people of New Hampshire and the government of Great Britain. They had to stand up to their former government that they had trusted for generations to protect their liberties. And then they joined in league with their sister states in the Continental Congress, which would eventually become the government of the United States, to execute those things external to their state. That's the whole nugget of American government, and it began here. Think about that. Now, we are now engaged in an enormous struggle. Last fall, we found ourselves on the precipice of history. Twice before in New Hampshire, there has been a flip-flop in the legislature. Both times, it enabled the government to usurp the rights and liberties of the people. But the lesson to be learned is that when there is a flip-flop in the legislature, there is the power to redefine government. You obeyed your Constitution because over the last few years we've learned that it is you who are the final arbiters of the Constitution of New Hampshire. That is to be the measure of whom you send to Concord. This legislature, there are maybe 100 of you with me, 100 of us with me up in Concord. That's good. We need 100 more.
Yeah.
There have been thousands of us who have been at rallies, in committees, on the phone, and in emails. But that needs to be 10,000s. We have accomplished much in this first session so far. We have passed HCR 19, a resolution affirming states' rights, out of the House. We passed House Bill 590 out of the House, which will begin to withdraw us from federal grants and aid.
Yeah.
But they still have to pass the Senate. And our budget cut 10%. And 30 bills reducing, 30 or more bills reducing regulations on business and industry. But they still have to pass the Senate. And still in the House, not yet able to escape, are firearms freedom, health care freedom, a general interstate commerce bill, a state defense force. If those bills are to escape the House and the Senate, they need you to stand behind us. Now, I came upon great dilemmas in the past couple weeks. And it really just sorted out in my head yesterday morning. This last session, I introduced a bill for recall of federal senators. Unfortunately, it was unconstitutional. But in the study of that, I learned many things. Recall of federal senators was in the original draft of the Constitution, obviously supported by James Madison, but it was removed without comment. In the Federalist Papers, Hamilton argued strenuously against recall of senators, but every argument of Madison could fit equally with or without recall. He remained silent. It was a topic of 3 state ratification conventions, Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. New York said, you must reestablish recall. Virginia said, whatever you do, there's got to be something more than just self-policing of the Senate. In the debate, Madison said nothing. Madison introduced the Bill of Rights based upon the recommendations of the states. One item noticeably missing was recall of senators. I struggled with that. How could this man have stayed so silent? Over the past couple days, I've realized that when one pledges one's life, one's fortune, and one's sacred honor to a cause, it can have many dimensions. He was dedicated to a cause of establishing constitutional government for a common government for 13 states. That meant that sacrifices had to be made. I'm now in a position where sometimes I will have to make sacrifices. I pray for the wisdom and the discernment to make the right sacrifices. But if I make sacrifices, that means I need people like you putting pressure on the legislature so that those sacrifices might not have to be made.
That's right.
We are in a great struggle. I want to read to you some words by Daniel Webster. Again, the issue is nullification. He was defending the people of New Hampshire as our state representative in Congress against a draft because it would impinge upon our corporate power of self-defense. The solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. These are the objects for which state governments exist, and their highest obligations bind them to the preservation of their own rights and the liberties of their people. I express these sentiments here because I shall express them to my constituents. Both they and myself live under a constitution that teaches us that the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. With the same earnestness with which I now exhort you to forbear from these measures, I shall exhort them to exercise their unquestionable right of providing the security of their lives, close quote. I say to you, there is no difference between tyranny at the point of a gun or a knife and tyranny at the point of a pen. And we must stand together against that tyranny. Now again, I pledge my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor to defend your liberty and mine. Now those of you who are out there who are legislators now, do you pledge to interpose yourselves and our government between the people of New Hampshire and Washington, D.C.?
I do.
Those of you who are not legislators, which is a much greater body, do you pledge to support your legislators who interpose themselves to defend your liberty? And if your legislators do not currently interpose themselves, will you work to inspire them or replace them? God bless you all. God bless New Hampshire. And God bless the United States if we can preserve it.